We are in the section of your notes entitled Eve of War. Eve of War. And we have been progressing. We've seen things building. The tensions are getting worse and worse. And now we've gotten to the point, remember, where General Gage was instructed by his superiors in England that he needs to stop this insurgency now. He needs to do something about it. It's gone on too long. So he's had some different forays out to find munitions, to find caches of ammunition and so on, and that has been somewhat effective, but not totally. And so he's looking for an opportunity to really make a big impact. And he hears that there are a couple of the Patriot leaders that are in Lexington, and he also hears that there is a bunch of ammunition being stored in Concord. They're real close together, so he figures, I'm going to make a big show of this. I'm going to take out a large army up there. We're going to capture those leaders. We're going to capture those stores, and that's going to be the end of it. That'll pretty much get rid of this insurgency. All right, so this is what happens. First of all, the preparations for this did not go unaware to the Patriots. They knew something was up, and the Sons of Liberty were prepared for what was going to take place. And the preparation took place as they had men named Paul Revere and William Dawes that were going to be responsible for alerting the colonists if the British regulars were coming. So if they saw the British soldiers coming out to Lexington Concord, then these two men were responsible for riding out ahead of them and alerting the colonists that the British regulars were on the move and they were coming towards them, so they could then respond with militia. The preparation was to give a signal to Revere from someone who was there near where the troops were as to whether the soldiers were going to go across the water and by boat over to the other shore and then go that direction, which was north of the city of Boston, or whether they would simply go on land on the isthmus that connected Boston to the mainland, and that would be by land. So, as we know from the famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the lantern that was put up in the Old South Church would indicate which way they were going. One lantern meant by land, two lanterns meant they're coming by sea. And so Revere and Dawes would know how to prepare, where to go. So, I'm sorry, the North Church steeple, not the Old South. So they would know how the troops were coming. So Revere and Dawes spread the news ahead of the British regulars. Later on, they would be joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott. We'll talk about that in a minute as they get closer to Lexington. All right, here's a map that shows the direction that the British regulars would take and that the riders took. Here's Boston. By land would mean that they would be going this direction, on land the whole way, and up toward Lexington and Concord. If they went by sea, that meant that they were going from the harbor, and they would be rowed in boats to the other side, and then from there they would march up to Lexington and Concord. So that's why it was important for the Patriots to know which way they were coming. All right, so it turns out that they went by sea. They went this direction. Paul Revere had a horse waiting for him on the other side. He went over there. The mare's name was Brown Beauty, and he set off for Lexington. At the same time, William Dawes went this direction to alert the people, and they would meet up here as they got close to Lexington. Here's Lexington. This is the way to Concord. All right. So you get an idea of the situation here. So Revere would ride to Lexington and Concord from Charlestown, here in this area, across the water, and Dawes would take the land route. Revere would stop at each house along the way to warn colonists of the arrival of British troops. Now, what are we normally told about what Revere was saying as he rode along? What did Revere cry out as he was riding and he got to the different houses?
The British are coming.
The British are coming! The British are coming! Right? You've all heard that, haven't you? He didn't say that. Why would he not have said that? Why would that have been nonsensical to the people along the way? Well, that was just to let him know whether the British were coming this way or this way. The people up here didn't see the lanterns. Only Revere and Dawes saw the lanterns. So why would it have been nonsensical for him to cry out, the British are coming? Caleb?
They were British too.
They were British too. What were they? Wait, what? We're coming? No, we're already here. They considered themselves British. So he didn't cry, the British are coming. What he cried out probably was something like, the regulars are coming. The regulars are on the move. Because the regulars referred to the British soldiers. You see? All right, so he is going along, stopping at the houses along the way. He approached the house where Adams and Hancock were staying. And if I remember correctly, I think it was Hancock's son-in-law, his house there in Lexington. They had gone to bed. It was in the night, and but they had a sentry outside because these are important guys, important leaders, and there's a sentry out there, and Revere comes riding up and shouting, you know, the regulars are out, the regulars are coming, and the sentry asked that he not make so much noise. You're going to wake everybody up. We have important people here. They're sleeping. And Revere replied, noise? You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out. And by that they knew, yeah, they're coming to get your two important guests. So he was able to rouse them out of bed, and they were able to get away long before the regulars got there. All right, so Revere and Dawes were soon joined by a third rider, Dr. Samuel Prescott. As they got to Lexington and they were moving on to Concord, Dr. Prescott was from Concord, but he was in Lexington. He was there courting a young lady, and you know, was on his way home. So rather late at night, you wonder about the young lady's parents. They did not have a curfew. I don't know, but anyway, they're riding along, and Prescott joins them. And then they didn't get very far along, but they were caught and arrested by British patrol. Now, there were British patrols that were out ahead of this. They're in different areas, and they just happened to get caught along the way by these British soldiers. Prescott was able to escape. He took off over the countryside. He was familiar with the countryside because that's where he lived. So he took off on his horse, you know, jumping over fences and going under trees and things like that, I suppose. And then Dawes escaped also. Revere was held for a while. And so they didn't know what to do with him. They weren't sure what was going on. And so after a while, they just let him go without his horse. But apparently they didn't realize what an important person he was in relationship to all that was going on. So Revere returned to Lexington in time to see part of the battle between the colonial Minutemen and British soldiers on the Lexington Green. Here is a picture of the house where Hancock and Adams were spending the night. And a letter that Revere wrote later on said this: I alarmed almost every house till I got to Lexington. I found Mr. Hancock and Mr. Adams at the Reverend Clark's. Now, I believe that may be a picture that I took of this house, and there was something unusual about the house, and I'm not sure I remember now what it was. because I don't see it now. There was something about the layout here of the house, so there was something not quite, it didn't quite match. I'm not sure. Does anybody see it? I give a better angle than I do right now. But anyway, if you ever go up there, you can see that house, and it's a little bit of walk from downtown Lexington, but not a bad walk. Nice homes that are there. All right, so the alarm has gone out. So the militia has been called out. The people come in from Lexington and around. They come into the village green. That's where they meet, and they are assembled there. It is still nighttime when they assemble, and the leader of the militia there is a man by the name of Prescott. I'm sorry, not Prescott. No, that's the doctor. Comes to my mind that that's also the name of the person in charge. Let's see. Oh, Preston. Okay, not Prescott. Preston. Captain Preston. Was there and assembled them. And basically it was nighttime, and they realized that nothing was going on, nothing was going to be happening for a while. So he dismissed them and said, all right, going back to your homes if you live here in town. If you don't, just go to a local tavern or whatever and wait for us to sound the alarm. Again, there's no point in standing out here in the middle of the night. So they did that. Well, as the British came along, the British soldiers, I should say, make sure I don't use a word that would apply to everybody. As the regulars came along, there was a part of the unit that went out ahead. And as those were coming toward Lexington, the alarm sounded. And so all these men gathered. And as they gathered together, Captain Preston said to them, stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. All right, so there's bravery, there's courage. We're going to stand up for our principles, but we're not going to start it. They're going to have to start it. But if they're going to start something, then we're willing to respond. All right, now here's a reenactment so you can see somewhat what it looked like. And by the way, if you go to Lexington, and I've taken several student groups there, it's kind of fun to go out there on the village green and line up right where the colonial militia lined up, and you can look down the road and you can imagine the British regulars coming your way and standing there waiting for them. Well, as the British regulars came, looking somewhat like this, coming along, they demanded that the militia disperse, and of course they refused. No one knows for sure who fired the first shot, where it came from. Whether it was one of the Patriots or whether it was one of the soldiers. Evidence seems to lean toward one of the soldiers. An accidental firing, like happened at the Boston Massacre, that got things started. But once a shot was fired, they all started firing, all the British soldiers at the militia. At this point, the colonial militia did not put up much of a fight. They returned fire, but many of them began to run. Some of them were shot in the back as they were proceeding away from the battle. There was one man who made it to the doorway of his house. His wife opened the door. He fell across the doorway dead. So it was not a good day for the colonial militia. To find is that there were 700 troops that reached Lexington. I'm sorry, Parker. It was all these peeve words. It was Parker that was the captain there, not Prescott, not Preston. Parker. And only 70. So you can imagine, why they would have taken off running after the shots started firing, because they're vastly outnumbered. And we've talked about how they were told to put down their guns, and they refused. Within a few minutes of the first shot, 8 militiamen were dead. Well, having taken care of that, the British proceeded. Of course, they did not find Adams and Hancock. So they proceeded to Concord, where they were sure that there were a lot of munitions stored. And so this is the road between Lexington and Concord, and they marched along. They came to what's called the Concord Bridge. And you can go there today. I found out, much to my dismay, that because it's a national park, you are not allowed to pretend to reenact any battles there. I had kids lining up as like the battle was, and the park ranger said you're not allowed to do that. Okay, so if you go there, don't try to reenact it. You might get in trouble. As you come to the Concord Bridge, now this is looking at it from the Lexington side, coming over the bridge. If you were to look up on the hill, a little ways from the bridge, you would see a farmhouse still there. That was the meeting place for the local militia, and so they had a good view of the bridge. Well, when they, knowing what was transpiring and that the British regulars had gotten to Lexington, people came in from the countryside for miles around, came to that location, and were heading down to the bridge to go towards Lexington. Well, you can see this bridge is curved, and so the militiamen got to this side of the bridge about the same time as the British regulars got to the other side of the bridge. And so they started firing at one another on the bridge, which led to the Patriots driving the British soldiers back. They retreated. And at that point, by then, nearly 4,000 Minutemen and militiamen arrived in the area. And as these British soldiers were retreating back to Lexington, the militiamen are coming in, and they are lining the road from Concord to Lexington and shooting at the retreating redcoats as they are heading back toward Lexington. So they're swarming in from all over, and it's kind of fun. The redcoats are running down the road, and the Patriots are shooting at them. It was, I'm sure they took out a lot of frustration. One of the unfortunate things that happened is that following the British soldiers being driven off of the bridge and going back toward Lexington, the British soldiers left in such a hurry that they left their wounded behind, which you're not supposed to do in battle, if at all possible. And there was a 12-year-old boy that arrived a little bit late, but he wanted to get involved in the action too. He wanted to be a Patriot militiaman. And so he saw a wounded British soldier laying there, and wanting to be part of the action, he took out his hatchet and drove it into the guy's head. That, unfortunately, was used as propaganda by the British government later on to show how bloodthirsty and savage these Americans could be. So the British were driven back. They fought in Lexington. As we told you, the British marched on the Concord. They did destroy some supplies in Concord, but on the North Bridge, they were forced to retreat. In fact, as the militiamen were gathering to go to the bridge at Concord, they saw smoke from the town of Concord, and and it was the British burning some of the supplies they found. They thought the British had set the town on fire. So that made them even more angry. So as they were charging down to the bridge, they had a little more incentive. And they peppered the redcoats with musket fire and forced them really all the way back to Boston. And as they went along the road from Lexington, they assembled again in Lexington and now decided to go. They're going to march back to Boston. They had accomplished some of what they set out to do, but they didn't expect the resistance that they received. And so they're marching back to Boston. Now, keep in mind, when did these soldiers begin this whole march? They began the evening before, and they were ferried across the river by boat, and then had to wait for everybody else to get ferried across. So you're either standing on one side on the shore or on the other side, and they were standing there for hours. Then they march all the way to Lexington during the night. So they have been up all night long, and a lot of that exerting physical labor in the marching. So they're now they're the next day at Lexington. They're getting shot at. They are tired, much in need of rest, and now they've got to march all the way back to Boston. So they were not in a good way. And so they marched back to Boston, and as they are marching back, the Patriots did the same thing as they'd done outside of Concord, and that is they began lining the roads, and all the militiamen are coming in from all the towns, and they're just sitting along the road behind stone walls, behind trees, and it's pretty easy to pick off the British soldiers because they're wearing these bright red coats. They're marching in line on the road. They're not hiding. They're just marching along. Well, eventually, the British commanders decide we need to send some people out on our flanks to get rid of all these people that are shooting at us. And so when they did that, they were able to kill some of the militiamen. But essentially, the militia, the Patriot militias, were able to harass the British soldiers all the way back to Boston. With the result that there were 74 British dead, 200 wounded or missing. Missing, that may mean that they were dead. It may mean that they deserted. Because remember, things weren't all that great for the British Army, and desertion was always a problem. There were 49 colonists dead and 41 wounded. One of the men that was killed was a man whose house was right on the road. And as the British were marching by, he decided, not very smartly, to simply shoot at the British from his house window. Well, it's obvious where he is, and so they fired back and killed him. Most of the guys that were firing at them from the woods along the road would fire and then move and reload. Remember, they have to reload every time and then fire again from someplace else. So they weren't. So by the time anybody came out in the woods to find them, they were gone. They kept moving. But this guy was in his house, shooting out his window, or maybe it was a door. I don't know. But just firing from his house. Not really a smart thing to do. All right, a lot of stories that are told about all the things that happened here. Very interesting reading if you want to read more about it. There's lots available. Here's what you find along the roadway. You find these rock walls all along. And here's the route that was taken. So we have the North Bridge here, where that battle was fought, and the British soldiers were driven back to Concord. And then here's Lexington, and now they're going all the way back from Lexington, going back to Boston, and they are encountering firing from the colonial militia all the way back. So by the time they got back, they are beaten in a lot of ways. So it's called the Shot Heard Around the World because this is the first real battle of the American Revolution, of the war. And now Americans are faced with a choice. They're going to have to either be on the side of the Patriots and be willing to use force of arms, or they're going to be on the side of the British government. And those people are called loyalists. They were loyal to the king and the parliament. Those who sided with the rebels were called patriots. Here's a picture of a magazine, it's called, where you keep all the arms and ammunition and gunpowder. This is one in Williamsburg, Virginia, but be similar other places too, up in the Boston area as well. And this particular magazine in Williamsburg was attacked by patriots trying to get all the weapons that they could from it as well. Well, a man by the name of Levi Preston was in his early 20s in the spring of 1775 when he fought at the Battle of Concord. Many years later, he was asked why he went to fight that day. And I think this is related in your textbook. He was asked, was it the intolerable oppressions of British colonial policy or the Stamp Act? He said, I never saw any stamps. Well, what about the tax on tea? He said, I never drank a drop of the stuff. The boys threw it all overboard. Well, it must have been all his reading of Harrington, Sidney, and Locke on the principles of liberty. Never heard of them. We read only the Bible, the Catechism, Watts' Psalms and Hymns, and the Almanac. Well, what was it? What was it that caused you to go out to Concord and fight? What made you take up arms against the British? Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should. And that's what it comes down to. It's the principles of government that caused the fighting. It was not taxes. It was not the intolerable acts. All those things contributed, but the main issue was they had always governed themselves. And now the British government was coming in and saying, you're not going to do that anymore. We're taking over. You can imagine. Since they started, they had governed themselves. And now the mother country is saying, you're not going to do that anymore. We're going to govern you. So Parliament passed the intolerable acts to what? Let's question ourselves, quiz ourselves here. What is the correct answer? Parliament passed the intolerable acts to collect taxes on tea, to punish Massachusetts, to separate French Canadians from English colonists, to protest against unfair laws. What's the correct answer? Hayden, what do you say?
B.
How many agree with Hayden? Yeah, that's the correct answer. Good. You have been listening. When British troops marched on Lexington Concord, what? They found a store of weapons and gunpowder. They shouted, the redcoats are coming. They surprised the colonists, or they clashed with armed Minutemen. Which one's the correct answer? What do you say, Sally? Did you say D? Are you losing your voice? Oh, and are you, what's the flight? Is the flight today? Do you have any lines? Drink some hot lemon water. Hot tea, some lemon water. All right, how many of you agree that it's D? All right, correct. All right, so you got some of the main points here. Oh, here's that interchange I just read. All right, so here, this picture has become kind of the symbol. It's called the Spirit of 76. And so we have young men involved, older men. Here's a man who's been wounded, blowing his fife, the fife and drums, leading others into battle. All right, so that is the beginning of the war. At this point, we're going to pause and consider that on Monday we will take a quiz over in your book, pages 85 to 111, and the notes that we have covering that section. So quiz on Monday over these beginnings, these things leading up to actual war between the American colonies and the British government. Any questions?